Picture the Caribbean in 1715. Pull back far enough, and you can see the whole thing. The deep blue of the Atlantic bleeding into the turquoise shallows around the Bahamas. The chain of islands stretching from Cuba down through Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, and all the way to Trinidad, curving like a broken jawbone around a body of water that belonged to no single nation. Now, zoom in. Follow the trade routes. Spanish galleons crawling north from Cartagena and Portobelo, loaded with Peruvian silver. English merchant vessels threading through the Windward Passage. French sugar ships hugging the coast of Saint-Domingue. Dutch traders slipping between the Lesser Antilles like they owned the place, which, in some cases, they did. Now find the smaller ships, the ones that don't follow trade routes. The sloops and brigantines lurking behind the cays of the Bahamas, tucked into the mangrove creeks of the Carolina coast, hiding in the shallow waters off the coast of Madagascar, on the other side of the world entirely. These are the pirate ships, and every single one of them, from Blackbeard's Queen Anne's Revenge to Bartholomew Roberts' Royal Fortune, had one crew member who mattered more than almost anyone else on board. Not the captain, not the quartermaster, not the gunner or the navigator or the guy who climbed the mast and screamed when he saw a sail on the horizon. The ship's carpenter, and the reason nobody talks about the carpenter is the same reason nobody talks about the person who keeps the power grid running, or the engineer who designed the bridge you drive across every morning. The carpenter's job was invisible when it was done right. You only noticed the carpenter's work when it failed. And when it failed on a wooden ship in the middle of the ocean, people died. So here's the question. Why was a guy with a hammer and a bag of oakum more valuable to a pirate crew than the man steering the ship? Why did pirate articles, the actual written contracts that governed pirate ships, guarantee the carpenter a higher share of plunder than almost anyone else? And why did some pirate captains refuse to sail without one, even if it meant sitting in port for weeks to find one? To understand that, you need to understand what a wooden sailing ship actually was. Not the romanticized version from movies, the real thing, because the real thing was basically a disaster held together by skill, sweat, and constant maintenance. A wooden sailing ship in the early 1700s was, at its core, a collection of planks fastened to a frame. Oak for the hull, if you could get it. Pine or fir for the masts and decking. Elm for the parts that sat below the waterline because elm could handle being submerged without rotting as fast as other woods. The planks were fitted together, and the gaps between them were sealed with oakum, which was old rope fiber picked apart and shoved into the seams, then covered with hot pitch or tar to make it waterproof. And here's the thing about that waterproofing. It wasn't permanent. It was never permanent. From the moment a ship touched water, it started leaking. Every single wooden ship in the age of sail leaked. The question wasn't whether your ship leaked. The question was how fast it was leaking and whether you could keep up with the water coming in. The hull flexed with every wave. The wood expanded and contracted with temperature changes. Before we go any further, I need to stop for a second, because what I've been showing you in these videos only scratches the surface. And I realized at some point that the full picture, the actual pirate code, word for word, the real punishment records, the exact treasure division shares, the ports that secretly funded them, it doesn't fit in a video. I put it all into one document, the Black Flag Codex. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let's keep going. The caulking loosened, the pitch cracked. Salt water worked its way into joints and seams and started softening the wood from the inside out. Below the waterline, marine organisms were eating your ship alive. Teredo worms, which aren't actually worms but a type of clam, bored tunnels through the hull planking. They could riddle a hull so badly that the wood looked solid from the outside but was hollow and crumbling inside. Barnacles encrusted every surface below the waterline, adding weight and drag that could cut your speed in half. And in tropical waters, all of this happened faster than anywhere else on the planet. A brand new ship fresh from a European shipyard might have a clean hull for 6 months in Caribbean waters. After that, it was a race against biology. This is what the carpenter was fighting every single day. The carpenter's workshop was usually located near the bow of the ship, below the main deck. It wasn't glamorous. A workbench, racks of tools, stores of timber, planking, nails, bolts, oakum, pitch, tar, and tallow. The carpenter kept an inventory of every piece of spare wood on board because running out of repair materials in the middle of the ocean wasn't an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. The tools of the trade were extensive: caulking mallets and irons for driving oakum into seams, augers and drills for boring holes, saws of various sizes, adzes for shaping timber, planes for smoothing surfaces, chisels, gouges, hammers, and a collection of specialized instruments that have no modern equivalent. The carpenter also maintained the ship's pumps, which were the last line of defense against flooding. If the pumps failed and the leaking overwhelmed the crew's ability to bail water, the ship went down. Simple as that. Every morning, the carpenter's first job was to sound the well. The well was the lowest point inside the hull where water collected, and sounding it meant lowering a measuring rod down to check how much water had accumulated overnight. If the level was normal, the crew pumped it out and moved on. If the level was rising faster than usual, the carpenter had to find the leak. And finding a leak in a wooden hull while at sea was exactly as difficult as it sounds. You're crawling around in the dark, cramped spaces of the lower hold, feeling along seams with your hands, looking for the telltale trickle of seawater, while the ship rolls and pitches and everything around you is damp and stinking of bilge water. When the carpenter found the leak, the repair options depended on the severity. A simple loosened seam could be recaulked. Drive fresh oakum into the gap, seal it with hot pitch, done. A cracked plank was more serious. The carpenter might have to cut out the damaged section and fit a new piece, shaping it to match the curve of the hull. If the damage was below the waterline and couldn't be reached from inside, the crew might have to careen the ship, which meant finding a sheltered beach, running the ship aground at high tide, and then tipping it onto its side so the carpenter could work on the exposed hull. Careening was a massive operation. It could take days or even weeks. The crew had to unload cargo and cannons to lighten the ship. They had to rig tackle from the masts to pull the ship over. And while the ship was beached and helpless, it was vulnerable to attack from other ships, from local inhabitants, from anyone who happened along and saw an opportunity. Pirates careened their ships regularly because they didn't have access to proper dry docks, and every careening was a calculated risk. The carpenter supervised the whole process, scraping off barnacles and marine growth, replacing damaged planking, recaulking every seam they could reach, applying fresh coats of tallow, sulfur, or whatever anti-fouling mixture the crew had available to slow down the worms and barnacles. Some ships used a sheathing of sacrificial planking below the waterline, a layer of thin boards that the worms would eat through before reaching the actual hull. The carpenter maintained this sheathing too, and all of that was just routine maintenance. The carpenter's job got truly critical during combat. When a cannonball hits a wooden ship, the wood doesn't just develop a neat round hole. Wood shatters. It splinters. A single cannonball impact could blow a hole 3 feet across in the hull planking and send razor-sharp splinters flying through the lower decks at lethal velocity. During the Age of Sail, more sailors were killed and wounded by wooden splinters than by the cannonballs themselves. A 6-inch splinter driven into a man's torso by the force of a cannonball impact was as deadly as any musket ball. The carpenter's job during battle was to keep the ship afloat. While cannonballs were punching holes in the hull, while the ship was shaking from broadside impacts, while wounded men were screaming and gunpowder smoke was so thick you could barely see your hand in front of your face, the carpenter was below decks with a damage control team, plugging holes. The primary emergency repair tool was the shot plug, a conical piece of wood, roughly shaped to fit into a cannonball hole. The carpenter drove it into the breach with a mallet, hammered it tight, then caulked around it and sealed it with oakum and pitch. If the hole was too big for a single plug, The carpenter might nail a lead sheet or a piece of leather over the damage as a temporary patch. If the damage was catastrophic, if a section of hull was caved in or a frame was cracked, the carpenter had to make a judgment call about whether the ship could stay afloat long enough to break off the engagement. During the Battle of the Nile in 1798, this wasn't pirates, but the principle was identical. The French flagship Orient caught fire and exploded, but several other French ships that took massive hull damage were kept afloat by their carpenters working frantically below decks while the battle raged overhead. The carpenter's work was the difference between a damaged ship and a sunken one. For pirates specifically, the carpenter's role during combat was even more complicated because pirates usually didn't want to sink the ships they were attacking. The whole point was to capture the prize and take its cargo. So while the pirates were firing at a merchant ship, their own carpenter was assessing the damage to the target and figuring out whether the boarding crew could take the prize before it went down. And after the capture, the pirate carpenter was often the first person sent aboard the prize to assess its condition and determine whether it was worth keeping, stripping, or abandoning. Some of the most valuable prizes in pirate history weren't ships full of gold or silver. They were ships that were simply in better condition than the pirate's own vessel. Pirates routinely captured merchant ships and then transferred their crew and guns to the captured vessel, abandoning their old ship entirely because the new one was sounder, faster, or less worm-eaten. The carpenter's assessment drove that decision. Now, here's where the carpenter's power on a pirate ship gets really interesting. Pirate ships were, by the standards of their time, remarkably democratic. The crew elected the captain. The quartermaster was chosen by the crew to represent their interests and settle disputes. And the distribution of plunder was governed by written articles that every crew member signed before the voyage began. These articles weren't vague guidelines. They were detailed contracts that specified exactly how loot would be divided. A typical set of pirate articles, like those attributed to Bartholomew Roberts or George Lowther, established a share system. The captain might receive 2 shares of plunder. The quartermaster might receive 1 3/4. Regular sailors received 1 share each. The carpenter? The carpenter typically received 1.5 to 1 3/4 shares. That put the carpenter on par with the quartermaster, and just below the captain in terms of compensation. In some pirate crews, the carpenter received the same share as the captain. Think about what that means. In a democracy where every man had a vote, the crew collectively decided that the carpenter deserved more money than the gunner, the bosun, the navigator, or the sailing master. They weren't being generous, they were being practical. Everyone on that ship understood exactly how important the carpenter was to their survival. The articles also typically included a separate provision for the carpenter. If the carpenter was wounded in battle and lost a limb, the compensation was among the highest of any crew member. Bartholomew Roberts' article specified that the loss of a right arm was worth 600 pieces of 8. The loss of a leg was worth 500. These weren't arbitrary numbers. They reflected the crew's understanding that a carpenter who lost a hand or an arm was a catastrophic loss to the entire operation. And there's another detail in the pirate articles that reveals just how valued the carpenter was. Most pirate crews included a provision that the carpenter could not be forced to fight during boarding actions. The carpenter was too important to risk in hand-to-hand combat. While the rest of the crew was swinging cutlasses and firing pistols, the carpenter was expected to stay below decks, managing damage control and keeping the ship operational. This wasn't cowardice. It was strategic thinking. Losing 3 regular sailors in a boarding action was unfortunate but manageable. Losing the carpenter could doom the entire crew. Some pirate captains took this even further. When pirates captured a merchant ship, one of the first things they did was interview the captured crew to find out if any of them were carpenters. Stop for a second. What you just heard about the pirate code is the part that rewrites everything you thought you knew. But it only lands when you see the actual shares, the exact fractions written into the Articles of Agreement, the punishments, the port records, the names of the men who funded them from government offices. It's all in the Black Flag Codex, linked in the description. 5 seconds. Grab it now, because what comes next builds directly on it. Link is below. QR code is on your screen. If a captured sailor was a skilled carpenter, he was often forced, meaning he was pressed into service on the pirate ship, whether he wanted to join or not. The pirates would let the rest of the merchant crew go, but the carpenter stayed. This practice of forcing skilled tradesmen was so common that it actually served as a legal defense for carpenters who were later captured and put on trial for piracy. They could argue, and often successfully, that they never chose to be pirates. They were taken against their will because of their skills. The courts recognized this defense because everyone understood the desperate need pirate crews had for carpenters. The trial records from the period are full of these cases. When Bartholomew Roberts' crew was captured in 1722 in one of the largest pirate trials in history, several crew members claimed they had been forced. The carpenter's defense was among the most credible because the practice was so well documented. But not every forced carpenter was an unwilling participant. Some carpenters saw the financial opportunity and went willingly while maintaining the fiction of being forced as insurance against future prosecution. A carpenter on a merchant vessel might earn 2 to 3 pounds per month. A carpenter on a successful pirate ship could earn hundreds of pounds in a single voyage. The financial incentive was enormous, and the carpenter had the additional safety of being kept out of direct combat. Beyond repairs and maintenance, the carpenter served another critical function on a pirate ship that rarely gets mentioned. The carpenter was the ship's modifier. Pirates didn't just use ships as they found them. They modified them extensively to suit their purposes. A captured merchant ship, for example, was designed to carry cargo. Pirates needed it to carry guns. The carpenter was responsible for cutting new gun ports in the hull, reinforcing the deck to handle the recoil of cannons, and modifying the interior layout to accommodate a larger crew. A merchant ship might have a crew of 20. A pirate ship of the same size might carry 100 men or more. The carpenter had to figure out how to make that work structurally. Pirates also preferred speed over cargo capacity. The carpenter might be tasked with removing interior bulkheads and cargo structures to lighten the ship, or with modifying the rigging to carry more sail, or with reshaping the hull's underwater profile by adding or removing planking to change how the ship moved through the water. These weren't minor alterations. They were significant structural modifications that required real engineering knowledge. The carpenter also built and maintained the ship's boats. Every ship carried at least one smaller boat, usually a longboat or a pinnace, used for going ashore, transferring cargo, or conducting raids in shallow water where the main ship couldn't go. Pirates used their boats constantly, and the carpenter was responsible for keeping them seaworthy. In some cases, the carpenter built entirely new boats from scratch, using materials salvaged from captured ships. There are accounts of pirate carpenters constructing small sloops on remote beaches using timber stripped from prizes, essentially building a new ship from spare parts. This was rare, but it happened, and it speaks to the level of skill these men possessed. The relationship between the carpenter and the captain was unique among all the crew dynamics on a pirate ship. The captain commanded the ship in battle and during chase. The quartermaster managed the crew and the distribution of plunder. But the carpenter had a domain that neither of them could override: the structural integrity of the ship. If the carpenter said the ship needed to be careened, it needed to be careened. If the carpenter said a particular maneuver would stress the hull beyond what it could handle, the captain had to listen. If the carpenter said the ship was taking on too much water to safely engage in combat, the captain could ignore that advice, but he'd be gambling with every life on board, and the crew knew it. This gave the carpenter a kind of veto power that no other crew member possessed. It wasn't formal, it wasn't written into the articles, but it was real, and captains who ignored their carpenter's warnings did so at their own peril. There are accounts from the period of crews mutinying against captains who refused to careen when the carpenter recommended it. The logic was simple: If the captain's recklessness was going to get everyone killed because the hull was failing, the crew had every right, under pirate democracy, to replace that captain with someone who would listen to the man who actually understood whether the ship could stay afloat. Now, what happened when a pirate ship didn't have a carpenter? It happened more often than you might think, and the results were predictably grim. Without a carpenter, routine maintenance fell to whoever on the crew had the most experience with wood, which might be nobody. Caulking was done badly, or not at all. Leaks went unrepaired. The pumps, which were mechanical devices that required regular maintenance, started failing. The ship got slower as marine growth accumulated on the hull. The structural integrity of the vessel degraded week by week. Charles Vane, one of the most notorious pirates of the early 1700s, lost his ship not in battle but to neglect. After alienating much of his crew, including skilled tradesmen, his ship deteriorated to the point where it was barely seaworthy. He was eventually caught partly because his ship was too slow and too damaged to outrun the naval vessel that found him. Stede Bonnet, the so-called gentleman pirate, who bought a ship and went pirating with no sailing experience whatsoever, had constant problems with ship maintenance. His background as a wealthy landowner from Barbados left him completely unprepared for keeping a wooden ship operational. On the other end of the spectrum, Blackbeard understood the carpenter's value perfectly. When he captured the French slave ship La Concorde and converted it into the Queen Anne's Revenge, the modification process was extensive. The ship was refitted with additional guns. The hull was modified. The interior was restructured. This wasn't a weekend project. This was months of work overseen by skilled carpenters, and the result was one of the most formidable pirate ships in the Caribbean. When the Queen Anne's Revenge ran aground at Beaufort Inlet in June 1718, it was the carpenter's nightmare scenario. A grounding could damage the keel, crack hull planking, and compromise the entire structural integrity of the ship. The archaeological remains of the Queen Anne's Revenge, which were discovered in 1996, show extensive modification work consistent with the kind of upgrades a pirate carpenter would have made. Additional gun ports cut through the hull, reinforced deck planking, structural modifications throughout. The carpenter's tools found at the wreck site are among the most interesting artifacts recovered. Caulking tools, augers, specialized woodworking implements that confirm the presence of a skilled carpenter on board. These tools were the carpenter's personal property, by the way. Unlike guns and ammunition, which belonged to the ship, a carpenter's tools were his own. The pirate articles specifically protected the carpenter's right to keep his tools, even if the ship was lost. If the crew abandoned ship, the carpenter could take his tools with him. They were that important. The training required to become a ship's carpenter was substantial. Most learned their trade through apprenticeships that lasted 7 years, starting as boys around 12 or 13 years old under a master carpenter at a shipyard. They studied wood types, learned joinery techniques, practiced caulking, and studied the principles of ship construction so they understood not just how to fix a ship, but why it was built the way it was, and where the structural weaknesses were most likely to develop. By the time a carpenter completed his apprenticeship, he understood the ship as a complete system. He could read the sounds a ship made and diagnose problems from the way the timbers creaked. He could feel a change in the ship's movement through the water and know that something had shifted in the hull structure. Experienced carpenters developed an almost intuitive sense for their ship's condition that no amount of formal inspection could replace. This is part of why carpenters were so hard to replace. You couldn't just hand someone a set of tools and tell them to fix the hull. Ship carpentry was a specialized skill that took years to develop. The supply of qualified ship's carpenters was always smaller than the demand, which is why pirates were willing to force them into service and why the pirate articles valued them so highly. Between battles and storms and emergency repairs, there were long stretches where the ship was just sailing, weeks of open ocean with nothing on the horizon. And during those stretches, the carpenter was never idle. He was inspecting constantly, running his hands along the hull planking below decks, checking for soft spots where rot might be starting. Examining the mast steps, the massive timber sockets were the masts seated into the hull, because a loose mast step could bring the whole rig crashing down in heavy weather. Checking every deck plank for signs of wear, every hatch cover for warping, every timber knee and bracket for cracks that might be spreading. The carpenter also played a role in one of the most feared events in any sailor's life, the storm. Tropical storms and hurricanes in the Caribbean were ship killers. The combination of massive waves, extreme wind, and violently shifting pressures could tear a ship apart in hours. During a storm, the carpenter's station was below decks, monitoring the hull for signs of failure. Every roll of the ship stressed the joints and seams. Every wave impact flexed the planking. The carpenter listened for the sounds of cracking timber, felt for the vibration of a frame giving way, and stood ready to make emergency repairs on structural members that were failing under the strain. If a plank sprung, meaning it separated from the frame and allowed water to pour in, the carpenter had to stop it immediately. In a storm, a sprung plank could flood the lower deck in minutes. The carpenter drove wedges and hammered lead patches and packed oakum into gaps while standing in rising water, in the dark with the ship rolling 45 degrees in each direction. It was terrifying work, and it required absolute calm under conditions that would panic anyone. The carpenter's mate, if the ship had one, assisted in this work. Larger ships might have both a carpenter and a carpenter's mate. The mate was usually a less experienced woodworker who was learning the trade and handling the simpler tasks, freeing the carpenter to focus on the most critical work. On smaller pirate vessels, there might be only the carpenter, and if he was incapacitated or killed, the crew was in serious trouble. There's a reason why, when you look at the organizational structure of a pirate crew, the carpenter sits in a category with the surgeon and the sailing master. These were the three specialist roles that a pirate ship couldn't function without. The surgeon kept the crew alive. The sailing master kept the ship on course. The carpenter kept the ship in one piece. The surgeon gets more attention in pirate stories because surgery is dramatic and gruesome. The sailing master gets mentioned because navigation is romantic and mysterious. But the carpenter just quietly kept everyone from drowning. Day after day, leak after leak, repair after repair. When you look at the Golden Age of Piracy as a whole, roughly 1650 to 1730, the ships that had the longest operational lives and the most successful careers were almost always the ships with the best carpenters. Not the biggest guns, not the most feared captains, the best carpenters. Bartholomew Roberts captured over 400 ships in his career, more than any other pirate in history. His ships were well maintained, regularly careened, and kept in fighting condition by skilled carpenters who were given everything they needed to do their jobs. Roberts understood that his success depended on his ship's ability to catch prizes and escape from naval patrols, and both of those things required a hull that was sound and clean. Henry Every, whose capture of the Mughal ship Ganges Sawai in 1695 was one of the most profitable pirate raids ever, relied on a well-maintained ship to chase down a much larger vessel. The Fancy was lighter and faster, partly because Every's crew had careened and cleaned the hull before the pursuit. The carpenter's work in preparing the ship for that chase contributed directly to one of the richest scores in pirate history. Sam Bellamy's Whydah, which sank in a storm off Cape Cod in April 1717, is one of the most extensively studied pirate shipwrecks in the world. The artifacts recovered from the wreck include carpenter's tools, spare planking, and caulking materials, evidence that the ship's carpenter was actively maintaining the vessel right up until the storm that sank it. The Whydah went down not because of poor maintenance, but because of one of the worst nor'easters in New England history. Even the best carpenter in the world couldn't have saved it from that storm. The lesson from all of these examples is the same. A pirate ship was only as good as the person keeping it afloat. And the person keeping it afloat was the carpenter. It's a strange thing, isn't it? We tell pirate stories about captains and their flags, about treasure maps and buried gold, about sword fights on burning decks. But the person who made all of that possible, the person without whom none of those adventures could have happened, was a quiet tradesman with calloused hands and sawdust in his hair, crawling around in the dark belly of the ship, hammering oakum into leaking seams while everyone else slept. The next time you see a painting of a pirate ship cutting through Caribbean waters with its black flag flying, remember that somewhere below that deck, a carpenter was checking the bilge, testing the pumps, and making sure the whole thing didn't sink before breakfast. Every pirate story is, at its foundation, a carpenter story. Because without the carpenter, there was no ship, and without the ship, there were no pirates. Just a bunch of angry men on a beach, staring at the ocean, wondering where their ride went.